This week's episode is sponsored by Ari.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
Do you think about the why aspect of the pictures you make? Do you view photography as a visual language? More importantly, do you ever attempt to change or expand on this why to add fresh dimension to your work? A new book by longtime visual editor Mike Davis can help you do just that. In creating visual narratives through photography, a fresh approach to making a living as a photographer, Davis offers his deeply engaged yet highly accessible insights about making photographs and making sense of those photographs, while also discussing the elusive art of selecting and sequencing pictures and other ways to create visual narratives. Join us for a lively conversation with Mike about the visual vocabulary he assigns to photographs, his ideas about elevating pictures beyond simply informational content, and his 3 different approaches to image sequencing. Mike will no doubt be offering other tips and tidbits to us from his long career in helping visual storytellers create images that last beyond the day. Tidbit number 1 from Mike's book: be like a cat, always know where the light is. Now a bit more about today's guest. Mike Davis is a visual consultant, an editor, author, photographer, and professor emeritus. He has worked independently with hundreds of photographers as well as in staff positions for organizations as diverse as National Geographic, the White House, and several of America's visually powerful newspapers. Mike was twice named Newspaper Picture Editor of the Year. He received the Sprague Award from the National Press Photographers Association, its highest honor. He has edited more than 40 books as an independent consultant, judged a wide range of photography competitions and grant programs. He's lectured widely and served as a member of various workshop and review faculty. Most recently, Mike spent 8 years as an endowed faculty member at Syracuse University's Newhouse School, where he taught visual storytelling courses and directed the Alexia grants. Mike Davis, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Alan. It's so nice to be here this morning.
It's great to have you. Before we jump in with questions, we spoke about this before we started recording. I received this book about a week ago, and it's a relatively small book. It's, about 6.5 by 9 or something. It's not too thick. However, it's the most dense book I've ever seen in my life. There's a ton of information. You even had to go through a smaller font size. This is a mine of data and information that is presented in a very clear way, considering the density and the amount of information you have there. It's not the kind of book where somebody can sit down and look at this and just go cross-eyed within a page and a half. You write well, and you present information in a very, very interesting way. This is a different book than I've seen for quite some time, and it's refreshing.
Well, thank you.
So, in your book's introduction, you describe photography as a visual vocabulary making a comparison to nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Can you elaborate on how these different terms apply to photographs, and especially how adjectives and adverbs differ from nouns and verbs?
Sure. The premise is that why you're going to do anything will determine the how of doing it. So if your goal is to simply show things happening or show what things look like, those are verbs and nouns, basically. Here's someone doing something. Here's what this book looks like. If you change the goal, the why, and what you're trying to do is convey qualities and say things about what's happening in front of you and what objects are in front of you, then you have to start to engage much more dynamically with the photographic process and bring yourself to the process instead of using generic applications. So to achieve an adjective, to say something is ebullient or ferocious or things like that, is a much more complex process and involves much more dynamic expression than simply saying, here's something happening. I think the key thing in this is when I started out, I thought it was like you had this generic approach of photographing things, and it was what you photographed that made the photographs interesting. And over time, I realized it's actually, if you look at what's on museum walls and describe them, it's not really interesting by itself. It is what the photographer brought to the image making that makes photographs interesting. And getting through that recognition as a starting point is really important.
And there's a lot of ways of making that difference too. And that's what I was kind of astounded where you start getting into the fine details of what makes a picture go beyond, the information that's right in front of you. In other words, there's a pretty flower, okay? There's a nice rock. There's some guy doing something strange or whatever the case may be. Because you get into a lot of things about focal length and distance and aperture and the relationship between all these things and looking at where light is coming from and moving yourself around to perhaps find a better perspective. You get into a lot of things about what I would just call discovery, whereas I get the impression that the worst thing, in your opinion, that a photographer could do is see something, take a picture, and walk away.
Absolutely. The third chapter deals with all of the things that you do from behind the camera to increase the likelihood of making a photograph that goes beyond. And certainly engagement is one of those things that is incredibly important. The less engaged you are, the less likely you will make an informed or dynamic photograph.
Now, you also refer to the most basic type of photograph as being informational, and you suggest that photographers describe a picture with words to determine if it rises above the basic by eliciting qualities that words can't adequately describe. Can you talk us through this concept a bit further and talk about the type of qualities that take photographs to the next level? I mean, we just touched on it a little bit, but what else is there?
The premise is that if you can use words to describe a photograph, then why do you need a photograph? If you get nothing more from looking at the picture than you just got imagining what it might look like through the words. So the process of introducing more dynamic is one of just starting with, okay, what could I speak to here? What qualities, what ideas, what notions, what questions could I raise in the making of a photograph in this setting? And then you start to learn more and respond to the setting more. My suggestion is when we go into a setting, the first thing is to interpret the light in the setting. Where does it have a specific quality? Where does it not? Where are the chances I could make a better picture from this angle? Light being the critical component of every photograph, and yet it often isn't fully considered. So then you start to read the color in a setting. Are there bright spots in this setting where if I include them, that's where people will start looking at the photograph? Are there warmer settings, cooler settings? Just reading the balance of color within the setting to help you start to determine from what angle, from what view, you can make a more compelling impression of the setting. Then deciding how far you want to be from what it is you're photographing. Of all the things, that's the one I think people least consider. Like if you are very close to something, there's a sense of intimacy or urgency that might come from that. Whereas if you're in a middle distance, that's more of a general, okay, I'm safe just looking at this. And if you step back in a setting, you can say something very different, give all the other views context.
And there's a visual tension that changes also when you pull back a little bit.
Absolutely. When we're making informational photographs, that requires you to stand a specific distance. You usually have to compromise color and quality of light because you have to stand at a specific point to be able to show a given thing happening. You really are compromising all aspects of composition as well because you need to be at a specific view.
Does that necessarily mean you're compromising composition?
Generally, yes. My definition of composition is the full realization of light and color and distance in conveying a three-dimensional space that is in front of you.
Okay. Now, I was reading through this stuff, and what came to my mind were the photographs by Berndt and Hilla Becker, who were photographers in Germany mostly and went through Europe back in the 50s and 60s, photographing old industrial area, a lot of coal silos and in furnaces and things. These were essentially informational because they photographed them from very set points of view, like you're describing, and they recorded them. And they basically made a document, a recording of these structures, but they went all over the place doing many of them. And to me, looking at them individually, and more so when they displayed them as groupings, which they did a lot, they took on a whole different feel. Now, these were informational photographs that went so far beyond just being informational. So is it possible to be both? And do you agree with me that what they did was, in fact, information that transcended being informational?
Yes, to a large degree. Their photographs were fascinating to look at. Their technical aspects, the large format, the compositionally, they were still felt three-dimensional to me. In that case, it is the accumulation of a body of work that says more than any individual photograph. So it's a narrative approach. By collecting similar views, you're able to say things beyond what any single view says. So if each of those settings was like a sentence, the collection of them becomes a short story. It's wonderful. Gerd Ludwig did this series of sleeping cars for several years. And it was just cars under tarps or whatever, sitting outside under a street light. And in one sense, they were purely informational, but they were beautiful photographs. And it was the sum of the parts that was greater than the parts.
I get that. Now, in a passage about informational pictures, you say one way a photographer can get beyond this basic type of image is to look for the opposite of what might seem obvious. Could you give us an example of the opposite? What are we talking about?
I can try. That's a hard one.
Okay, please.
That's a hard one to explain. Being in Minnesota here, and it's freezing cold and snowing outside right at the moment. An example would be if you're trying to convey the sense of warmth that can come from being inside, or just sitting by a fire in a warm light, and then you include the opposite, some view of the coldness of the outside. That's going to be a stronger quality generally than if you only showed the warmth. So part of that is introducing more dynamic than singular expressions, being aware of the whole of a setting and how much of it you should include and not include. Lots of different dynamics.
So like a lumberjack with a kitten is what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of.
I've got another thought about that idea of opposite, although it's not exactly opposite, where you mentioned the series that Gerd Ludwig did of the sleeping cars. I know those pictures, but immediately I started to think about the fact that he's conveying this human quality of someone sleeping to a machine. And it sort of humanizes the picture. Would you say that kind of thing is a factor as well?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive thing, I think you just said. Part of the way of being opposite is contradicting the nature of what's in front of you. So if it is just a book, okay, how can you introduce a quality that might make you feel something that elevates it beyond a book? So it's opposite in that sense.
Yeah. Conveying human qualities to any kind of object, it seems, is a way for the viewer to connect more actively with a picture.
Absolutely.
When considering how to elevate a photo beyond purely informational value, the term pre-visualization comes to mind as a helpful tool. What's your opinion about using pre-visualization to help elevate the caliber of one's images?
Like most terms, I think pre-visualization doesn't mean one thing. Like Ansel Adams talked about that in the context of understanding all the technical aspects that you had to bring to the making of photograph.
I know my interpretation of it is probably different from yours and Jill's as well. That's a kind of a goofy word in a way, but go ahead, continue, please.
So I think the idea of considering how you're going to make a photograph before you make it is absolutely valuable. The way I would put it in the context of this book is that you ideally learn as much as possible about what you're photographing before you photograph it. Even if you have, I would say, if you have 5 minutes to make a photograph, use 4 of them to understand the setting and the people and whatever it is you're trying to focus on, and then craft that notion and then respond to the setting in the remaining minute with the actual making of the photograph. So that's a form of pre-visualization. And then if you expand that to, I know I'm photographing something tomorrow, then learning as much as possible before you show up starts to form an image in your mind that is inevitably going to change, but it starts to get you thinking and formulating ideas and questioning what could I say about this? What could I speak to? And then the deeper and richer you get into it, the more you can push yourself from that point.
But I think also, depending on what you're photographing, that could greatly limit your ability to pre-visualize. I mean, a good example, you have some really, really nice photographs of the bike racing. When you made those pictures, everything was very carefully composed. And we talk about pre-visualization. That means you have to get there and absorb what's there before you start looking through the finder and pressing shutter buttons. You don't always have that option. Sometimes you show up or something is just happening spur of the moment, like a war zone. I don't know how much time you have to pre-visualize if you are on the front lines of a war zone, or any kind of fast-breaking news or a sporting event, for instance. I mean, you could pre-visualize to a point where you think, I think there's going to be a shot lining up here, where they'll be doing some kind of a play on the field or whatever the case may be, or around a bend where the bikes will be coming around. But there is a limit to what you can pre-visualize when the action is real-time and not repeatable.
Absolutely. I remember the Jim Nockway documentary. At some point, you see him making photographs in very active settings. And I could see him moving an inch this way and 2 inches that way, slightly higher, slightly lower. And it's as if he were recomposing to make the composition more refined and increase the likelihood of these more complex dynamics coming to play. So regardless of how much time you have, the way I've described it is, if you think of what is in front of you as a theater stage, how much of the stage do you need to show? And where are you going to place all of the elements within that stage so that when the actors act out, that's the fruition of the photograph. It's not the starting point of the photograph.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, generally speaking, the goal of any photograph, if you're really taking your time, is eliminate whatever is not necessary. Get down to just the core basics of what the image is about. Eliminate everything that's not needed. Just go, 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 go. It's like the same thing as getting closer until you can't recognize, and then back up a hair, and then you're there.
Absolutely.
I guess it's the same thought process.
In a way, and in that sense, the structure and the creating of photographs can either be additive or subtractive. If you're subtracting, okay, what's the essence? How do I get down tiny, tighter? Yeah, there it is. And then, as opposed to additive, there's one photograph in the book of a cyclocross race where you see a wide view and there are riders arching around the foreground, and then another group in the middle ground, and then way back in the deep, there are two riders on a trail just crossing into the frame. And that, for me, is an additive process. I knew in making that photograph that deep, deep part of the photograph had to have something happening in it, or the photograph would fail. Another expression I often use is that the smallest thing in a photograph that holds the whole thing together is the most important element.
I get that. Photography, the act of making photographs, has changed dramatically. You've been doing this for 40 years. I've been doing it for a little bit longer than that. It's a different game right now. The whole aspect of photography is different. I always say that when I started off, a camera there was no automation in things. It was a mechanical box. You had to understand how the shutter worked, how the apertures, film speed, light, and everything. It was a thinking process. I joked around. There was autofocus. You autofocus before you take the picture. But it's all changed right now. And if some ways for the better and some ways not. I mean, let's face it, the phone has revolutionized the way we capture things. Everybody can be a very good photographer, okay? To a certain extent, just using those basic tools. Now, you've been working as a visual editor for many years and for a wide range of individuals and organizations. What changes have you seen, if any, over time in approaches to image making and picture selection?
Well, what you just described is the reason I wrote this book in the end. The changes have been essentially that there's still a baseline way of making photographs. It's just that almost anybody can meet that standard now through their phone or whatever. So to make a living at this magical craft, you have to rise above what everybody else is doing. And in that sense, I think it's a much better thing. There's certainly still environments where really average, boring pictures are being published, but increasingly they're less populated by people who are earning their primary living in that environment. So what that does is raise the bar in what we're trying to speak to, what we're able to say, and the different ways of saying that. Mallory Benedict, I think, is right now teaching a workshop at the Santa Fe workshops where she's teaching people how to do narratives in different environments and how to edit for different spaces. And that is an almost requirement. When I was teaching, the assignment structure was such that students had to figure out multiple ways of saying things about what was in front of them. And it just expanded their capability, expanded the marketplace that they could enter. And that's essential these days.
You used something that really just triggered me about editing for the intended place where the photographs will be seen. It used to be you'd take a picture, it was either for yourself, a print on the wall, or for the shoebox. If you were a working photographer, it might be prints for somebody's wall, if it's portraiture, or work that ends up in magazines, editorial or advertising. So there were specific targets. There are more places for photographs to be now. What are some of those places that did not exist when you and I started out? What are some of the new venues?
It's as much venue as it is medium. I mean, as you said, it used to be print or not.
Yeah.
Basically.
Hold the slide up to the window. That's what it was.
Whereas now, there's so many different ways that you can express photographs, even in pure photo books. Photo books used to be this super high standard that there were so few of them produced and it was expensive and chances of getting published were minimal. Whereas now there are scores of publishers and so many different ways to produce books. And they can become primary marketing tools if that's the best way for you to approach. But then there are so many niche publications and environments. You figure any pursuit on the planet probably has some publishing connected to it. And if your passion is that pursuit, the goal is to connect with the people who might pay you to do that, as opposed to the traditional, I work for magazines, wire services, or newspaper is covered most professional photographers or commercial advertising. Increasingly, even people who work in any one of those also have marketplaces in the others. Talking to Ron Aviv recently, he's talked about how he has a commercial realm, he does exhibits, he teaches, he does editorial work, other things that is becoming de rigueur. What that's doing is raising the bar for the learning curve of new people, but also requiring some more seasoned people to relearn and expand their abilities and how they put themselves out there. And that too was a primary factor in writing this book, is to speak to that environment.
That is a good point, because I find it kind of humbling that even though I've been taking pictures for over 5 decades, there's so much new stuff that's still happening, and it's an evolving media. It's an evolving craft. And yes, you can go back and still shoot film, with an old film camera, and you could play around with all kinds of digital cameras and lenses. The choices of optics are ridiculous. And equipment is quite affordable, in so many different ways. But the thing is, now AI is coming into the realm of being used. And I describe it as photo illustration, not necessarily photography. To me, it's a form of photo illustration, which we've had for a long time. This is just a new variation of it. But you can't stand still. It used to be that you become a master and you were the master of a craft. That's not the case anymore. We're talking about evolution. Well, over time, how has the relationship between photographers and picture editors changed? Is it the same dance right now, or is there a different dynamic to that?
Increasingly, I'm finding that photographers, visual storytellers become specialists And it used to be that, I'm known for photographing glass or sports or specific types of content. Whereas now the specialization is tending to be much broader. If you have settings like Lynn Johnson is one of my favorite photographers on the planet and the most amazing human. If you have a subject matter that is impossible to photograph, then she is the photographer to take that on. If you want to become known as an environmental photographer, then understanding and embracing all there is about that, or developing a specialty even within that topic. So specialization has become a much broader thing. And then developing connections with picture editors is usually only a part of your business plan. Editorial work is neither as voluminous nor as high paying as it once was relative to cost of living and gear and everything else. So in a sense, picture editors become a partner for helping you accomplish a certain part of your business life, but not the whole thing. And it is often the editorial work that might prompt a commercial client to say, whoa, you just got published in the New York Times. I want to work with you.
If you want to know what's happening, you talk to a picture editor and you'll have an idea of what's happening and what is expected of you and where you should be focusing your time and effort. And I never thought about that, but that is actually quite true. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, it's interesting. The dynamic and expectations of picture editors have changed a lot since I was filling that role. It used to be, you only dealt with still photographs and in the print environment, whereas now visual editors, visual producers might have to deal with 10 different ways of presenting a given topic and working through with each photographer how to produce those dynamics. Or might be that a photographer does the still, you hire someone else to do the video components. You have someone in-house can do the high-end development and production. And it requires an understanding of all of those skills and an ability to pull them together in as creative a way as possible. Somebody told me the Times now has 40 picture editors or visual producers, editors.
Really? Well, I imagine they because they get inundated with imagery all day long and everything. They have to have that many people going over it.
Absolutely. The Washington Post must have 6, 8. It's sad because the last newspaper I worked for was the Portland Oregonian, and I think we had 21 staff photographers and 6 picture editors. And now I don't think there are any picture editors, and they're down to 2 staff photographers.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that you use the word producer when talking about picture editors today. I mean, there are tons of newspapers and other publications that have lost their picture editors and whole departments. Would you say maybe in some cases they've been replaced by a different terminology?
In some cases, for sure. One page of my book tapped Elizabeth Chris and asked her to start listing all the ways you could make a living as related to photography in some sort. And then added a bunch myself, and it's almost a page-long list. The bottom line is there are more ways to make a living now than there ever have been, both in terms of where work exists and the people's skill sets to produce the work. It's just that it's harder to discover them than it used to be.
Interesting.
Remember years ago, the National Press Photographers had a job list, and it would be pages long. And it was very easy to go to. You apply and boom, it worked or it didn't. Whereas now there might be 3 or 4 jobs on that list. That's part of the importance of developing that specialization, that it puts you into an environment, then you define the marketplace from within that environment. And had you not done that process, you wouldn't even have known that that was a possibility.
Right.
It used to be that the mindset was that if you are if you live in a big city, if you're working a photographer in a large city where there's a lot of competition, you have to be a specialist, which made sense to a point where somebody described it where, they needed a photograph of a red Chevy, but you only had blue Buicks. They didn't think you could do it.
Yeah.
It was that crazy where they want to see a portfolio of red Chevrolets to know that you can photograph a red Chevrolet. And if you lived in a smaller market, away from the large cities, you had to be more of a generalist because the amount of assignments that came back could be anything, and there were a few people who can do it. So you had to be more or less a jack of many trades. Is that still the case here?
Yeah, to an extent. I think both dynamics are at play now. You still have to be a specialist, but if you're in a smaller market, you might be able to make a certain percentage of your livelihood from typical assignment work. Rory Doyle comes to mind. He's known as, in Mississippi, I believe, someone who can just engage with people in any kind of everyday flow of life setting and make photographs that speak beyond that. So for me, that's a specialization, and it can be applied in commercial settings, in books, in editorial work, in daily journalism assignments. So it's just a broader net of the idea of specialization than what it used to be.
Gotcha. You took most of the pictures in your book, and they're accompanied by some very engaging captions that drive home your ideas. Did you have these ideas and intentions in mind, as you were making these photographs, or were you fully in the moment at that moment in time and applying your ideas to the photos after the fact? How'd that work out?
Some combination of those. Certainly the evolution of the making. I mean, the oldest photograph in there, I think, is from 1987 of Ronald Reagan visiting Columbia, Missouri, when I was a grad student there. And ironically, the photograph as it appears in the book is very different from how it got cropped to be used in the newspaper back then. So in a way, it's a reflection of the growth of my understanding of how you can say things differently with photographs. The cropped version was simplistic and not very dynamic, whereas the whole frame feels more complete. So in a sense, it's my current understanding applied to the past. And I suggest in the book that everyone do that. Go back to your historical images and reconsider them and think about how you've changed or not and grown and how your seeing could evolve just based on, wow, I chose it then and here's what I would choose now. So the photographs presented in the book, especially in the cycling work, I was striving to say things beyond, here they are racing bikes. Here's Ira Ryan racing the bike that he made, but instead conveying the quality and the character of the setting and the energy and the challenges and the exaltation.
I took a good look at those photographs. I was very impressed with the way you composed those pictures and the moments that you pressed the shutter button. They were really good moments. You knew exactly what was going on. You were definitely in on the action, and you were there in the moment. No doubt about that. You were watching what was going on. Something I'm a little bit curious about is that it's obvious that filling the frame is an important thing, and composing your picture initially as tight as you can and as complete as you can is paramount to creating a good photograph. Do you believe in cropping? If at the end of the day, the picture's going to be that much better if it's cropped a little bit here, there, or somewhere? I know there are many photographers that say, no, you can't do that. But the bottom line is as soon as you choose a camera format and the lens, you're already cropping because you're eliminating from 360 degrees around you for what that lens will see and what that format, be it square, rectangular, whatever, will see. So if you have a picture that you shot, say, with a 35 millimeter camera, but it looks better as square or cropped in some fashion, are you opposed to that, or is that going to be something that is just, sacrilegious?
The goal is to create as complete a frame as you want to express within the camera. And you can go in saying, you know what, this setting I think is better expressed as a square or a panoramic or whatever shape you decide, but then strive to create that shape within the camera to the extent possible. Certainly if a slight refinement in cropping would it elevate the strength of the photograph, absolutely crop it. But there's a school of thought that you crop for impact, which usually means you just crop to the edge of whatever is pictured, and it tends to render the photographs almost neutered because it will reduce it to a one-layer image. Most people use the word layered when they're trying to say the photographs are really deep and dynamic and dimensional. I use the words spatially geometric because plywood has tons of layers, but it's flat as hell.
Oh, I got to take note of that one. Okay, quote of the day.
If instead spatial geometry means you're connecting different points within the frame and creating relationships, and you're creating planes of activity that are at different angles. It doesn't mean that there's tons of stuff or elements within the frame, but just connecting 3 points. There's a painter who was just phenomenal. Edward Hopper, learned from him a lot. His name I'm blanking on right now, but it's in the book. And he would often place 3 elements against a lone element. Generally, the even numbered elements within a photograph, it flattens them. But it was the spatial relationship between the two where one might be in the foreground and the others in the background, and yet a 4th and a 5th element coming in there. So the idea of triangulation within photographs is probably the most important compositional thing.
Mm-hmm.
Where those triangulated points connect at different points, and there are multiple triangulations happening within the frame.
Mike, I'm curious. You talk a lot in the book about photographing with intention. With your own work, was there a defining moment in your past where you came to the realization of photographing with intention? Or is that just something that evolved gradually over time?
There was one thing. I got to give credit to Gregory Heisler. He came to Syracuse a year after I did, and we used to talk endlessly. And God, it was one of the best experiences of my life to be able to hang around Greg.
Yeah.
And he introduced me to the idea of intentionality in a way that I hadn't thought of it. So, it's a continually growing process. The first story that I worked on where I started to understand the greater potential was working with photographer Mike Gallegos in Albuquerque in 1989. And he came back with a set of photographs from a daily assignment to photograph lap swimming. Come on, could you think of a more boring thing to photograph in the world than lap swimming? This was a slide film day, and processed it, laid that roll, 36 frames down on the light table, and there were about 4 frames that just glowed. They popped out like they were God touching them or something. And I went to those and started talking to Mike. We devised this notion of, okay, there were 15 minutes of the morning where the light raked across the surface of that swimming pool. And it was during those moments when people were just starting or just in the heart of their effort or just ending. So what if we built an essay just in those 15 minutes over a period of time and spoke to the different qualities of what it was meant to swim laps? And that was the first time, I think, really that I understood it's not what you photograph, but how you photograph. What is your intention? What are you saying and why?
And what makes that particular moment in time or choice of elements special?
There you go. That's the essence. The goal is to make photographs that are unique expressions.
Mm-hmm.
They can be unique coming together of events. They can be your unique perspective on them, your unique seeing, but it is the expression, the intention that matters.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And that doesn't mean you have to think about this stuff endlessly or wait 42 days for the photograph to come to fruition. This can happen in a millisecond if you're extremely perceptive and are able to quickly assess the setting and boom, got it. Okay.
Mm.
It can be purely responsive, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking about cameras, what gear are you using these days? Just what's your current choice of cameras and lenses? Do you have any favorites or anything?
I do. I'm a bit of a fanatic about trying to stay up to date. I've used Canon, Sony, Fuji, briefly Nikon, and I just upgraded to the Canon R5 and R6 and sold all my old EF lenses and bought a set of RFs.
Your back's feeling better, I'll bet.
Yes. I used that Canon RF 100 to 500 with a 1.4 on it to photograph wildlife, mostly birds.
Yeah.
Even with that, it's not a burden.
No. There are some good improvements happening in the camera world. I won't argue with that. Anyway, we've been chatting here for a while, and I think it'd be a great time to take a short break. So we're going to do just that. And when we come back, more with Mike Davis and creating visual narratives through photography. Stay tuned.
Whether it's through the versatility of the Orbiter directional LED, the soft cover of Sky Panel LED panels, or the high performance of the Daylight and Tungsten series Fresnels, ARRI is dedicated to producing design enhancements that match the swift pace of creativity and technology as they light the way beyond. Learn more about ARRI lighting products at bnh.com using the link in our podcast show notes.
Okay, we are back with Mike Davis. And again, Mike is the author of a wonderful book called Creating Visual Narratives Through Photography, A Fresh Approach to Making a Living as a Photographer. And as I mentioned at the head of the show, this is a very dense, and I don't use dense in a negative way, a book that is very dense in data and information, and there's very little in here, if anything, that is just fluff. I mean, this is just all good information from somebody who has been around the block more than a few times and understands it, and he lives this stuff. So again, Mike is a great author for this type of information, and he presents the information really, really well. I just want to go back to one thing. We were talking earlier about approaching when you're photographing something, a person or a place or something, and you talk about going around and looking at light and perspective. And you talk about choosing the right focal length. That's one of the things you get into. One of the things that certain schools of thought approve of is that don't get involved with too many lenses. There are some schools of thought that say, go out with a lens, a camera, a lens, and concentrate on taking photographs using what you have, which kind of goes against the think about what the focal length is, because that's part of the equation of what the final photograph is going to be. So do you agree with this thing that maybe it's okay once in a while or a good idea to go out with a lens? What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I know that like some photographers over the years have produced entire National Geographic stories with like a 28 and a 35 or a 35 and a 50 or a 24 to 105. So precision of thought and execution doesn't necessarily require having 40 lenses. That can sometimes be a negative.
Mm-hmm.
Clarity of intention is the starting point, and then what tools do you need to express that?
I know from personal experience, when I was shooting editorial, I would routinely have, 7 or 8 lenses with me from 15 millimeter to 500. And I know that there are photographs that I have, and the only reason I have is because I had the right lens with me, because other focal lengths would not have worked, at least not with the same impact, or maybe not worked at all. And at the same time, I feel so free right now to walk out with a 50 millimeter lens, which used to be a lens that I hated. I could never relate to a normal lens, except for the past 3 years. Suddenly, I feel liberated. I go out with a camera, a normal lens.
Yeah.
And it's liberating to me. And it's forcing me to be a better photographer because I don't have those options. I go, okay, here's what's in front of you. Here's what you got. Work with it. Make something happen. And I surprise myself. I mean, not all the time. Sometimes the pictures suck. Okay. But quite often I walk away with a picture and go, I didn't think I could ever do that with a 50 millimeter lens because 50s are boring. But they're not.
Does it make sense that in that case where you had to have every lens available, you were more of a problem solver? You were put into situations where you couldn't predict what was going to happen, so you needed,
yes,
a bag of light and a bag for lenses and strobes and all that stuff to solve whatever problem was in front of you.
Exactly.
Which is essentially the opposite of what we're talking about, where you go in more informed and aware and have a greater clarity of what you're trying to speak to and can choose your tools to accomplish that more clearly.
But many assignments don't give you that option. You're literally, okay, here's what we need, go, and we need this in 4 hours.
Sure. In which case, you need the bigger bag and a couple people to help you carry them.
There's no one solution here, but there are exceptions to all of the rules. But anyway, I was just curious to know what your take would be on all that stuff. And again, you gave me a lot of food for thought. I mean, I've gone back thinking about a lot of things that I've been doing and stuff like that. And that's one of the wonderful things about this book is that, it just sort of gave me a little kick in the ass a little bit and made me think about some of the things that I've been doing and taking for granted, or just saying that that's the way it is. Anyway, in section 4 of your book, you describe 3 approaches to sequencing. The first is foundational sequencing that moves the narrative forward. Secondly, you have a roller coaster sequencing. And third, sequencing that resembles a musical experience. We can get into a whole conversation on this whole thing. Would you ever recommend combining more than one sequencing approach in a single project?
Almost every time, yeah, that happens. Increasingly, I've started to think about this stuff on a spectrum. And if you can identify the ends of the spectrum, it can help you understand, okay, where within that should I fall? In terms of sequencing, the choices are at one end of a spectrum are purely informational, son of a gun, parallel to the making of images, where you choose that based on, I'm trying to show the process happening. So this happened first, this happened second, this happened third, and that's how you choose the order of the imagery. And sometimes that's the right choice. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the more lyrical, experiential type of sequencing, where it is the roller coaster, it is the quality of music, it is the pure aesthetics and visual aspects of an image and what comes out of the photographs, what you feel from them, that generates the sequence. Most edits end up being somewhere in the middle of those two. And some parts of a given larger edit might be purely lyrical, and then you use an informational bridge to get to the next set of lyrical images. It's a real art, I think, sequencing and crafting narratives.
It's choreography.
At that point, it's the realization of narrative. It's not the crafting. If you have to rescue a set of pictures by the editing process, then you probably didn't do so well in the making of the images.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and it's actually quite true. What's the most visually successful book you've worked on in terms of editing and sequencing? Which one stands out for you as your favorite or favorites?
I've had the pleasure of working with Matt Eisch on 3 of his books, and then a 4th one is in the wings. Of those, I think Sin and Salvation in Baptist Town was the most purely lyrical. It's a beautiful, square book. It's more about the experience of being in this space and getting to know people and the flow of that life in that small area of a given town.
Yeah.
That's the most fun. Even like Saul Nealman's series of 3 books on weird sports, of all things, weird sports. But playing with the sequencing of that was just absolute blast. And
That sounds like fun.
even like Scott Strazzani's Common Ground book, where he bridged between decades of life in a specific piece of ground that went from farm to development. Some of those were literal pairings. Then you could bridge and go beyond the pairings and speak to larger aspects of life in each of those settings.
I'm not familiar with that book, but I definitely want to take a look at it now. So I just jotted that one down for myself.
Mike, how long does it usually take to sequence a book when you're working with a photographer and you have all the elements collected?
It depends largely on what number of photographs we start with, which is like in Matt and Saul and Scott, it was quite a few thousand. But even then, it's, 10 to 15 hours for the whole process. If you start with a narrower set of, say, 1,000 pictures and get it down to a book, it might only take 5-6 hours.
Let's say, generally speaking, when you start editing photographs by a photographer, let's face it, photographers are very possessive of their photographs and the integrity of it and their intention. And again, this is their soul in many, many ways. And they're handing it over to you, okay? And you're not vested the same way in this thing. You're looking at it from a different perspective. You're designing a book. What's the percentage of time that photographers look at your selections of images and how you're laying them out and how you're sequencing them and say, yeah, this is better than what I had. This makes sense, compared to those who say, no, you don't understand what I've been doing. You've got it wrong. And I imagine there are some that just can't handle what you're doing. Or am I wrong?
Well, the approach that I try to take is to speak to what photographers are doing well and then speak to my definition of success among their work. That allows to address, okay, here are photographs that are not as successful, and then here's why I don't think they're as successful. So once you go through that, one of informing my perspective, I guess, in why I'm choosing what I'm choosing. Only a couple times photographer says, nah, go screw yourself. I don't like that. in the many hundreds. Almost without exception, though, they have said, I never would have thought of it that way.
Ah, okay. And that's the job of a photo editor.
Yes.
To shake you a little bit. I think that's so important. I really, really do. I think any photographer, if you're not sharing your pictures and getting feedback from other people, especially people who look at photographs a lot, and be able to suck it up and listen to what they have to say, because, again, a dwarf standing on the shoulders of a giant sees further into the woods. Let's put it that way, okay? And there's always something to learn from. In your section on picture editing, you talk about photographers you've worked with who make far more complex photographs than they select for themselves, but then tend to choose the stronger, more complex photographs after you point that fact out to them. Do you think this is because photographers are a little bit too close to their work? It's like we were just talking about, or they're making safe choices, or is it just the fact that, they need an extra set of eyes, or all the above?
Yeah. It's important to recognize that selecting photographs is a different skill from making them.
Yes.
And it requires different levels of understanding and clarity. One thing I've found is that the clearer a photographer has been in what they were trying to say in a given setting, the more likely they will choose photographs that achieve that.
And do you find that it's more experienced photographers that do that, or is this a learned experience?
I think it's more discipline specific, like art photographers.
There you go.
So many of them say, what the hell's a picture editor? I never even heard of that. I pick my own because I know exactly what I want and what I was trying to accomplish, and go away. Well, wait a minute. What do you think of my work? Whereas people who are trying to capture life in front of them as it unfolds, and they've made thousands of pictures in a given setting, may not recognize which of those settings are most telling or most compelling, and which realizations, which images, photographs are the most successful.
And would you say that when editing, your first impressions are usually the best ones? I mean, you look at some, you get some impressions right up front, and you keep editing, going back and forth and back and forth. You keep coming back to the same images for the most part? Or do you find that after reviewing it for yourself, you say, well, maybe this isn't the right one? Or again, this could be one of those questions where, yes, all of the above.
Yeah, there's a lot.
There are no absolutes for a lot of these questions, unfortunately.
The process I describe in the book is one that I use myself in my own work and when looking at other people's work, and that is to go about 7 passes through photographs, a set of photographs. So in the first pass, you're just looking at a contact sheet view, a grid view on a computer, and scrolling down through and forming general impressions. And maybe you see a specific frame, and like, oh God, thank God that worked. Oh, what? That didn't? Oh, man. And you're just beginning the process of getting over the experience of having made them. Then the next step, you select an image, the first image, and then make it large on screen, and then scroll through all of the images with no judgment, just more like you've just opened the bottle of the wine and you're getting a sense just from the nose. The third pass, then you start to say, okay, if you're in Lightroom, this is a 1 star. This one I don't ever want to see again. So go through the whole set and elevate them to a 1 star level. And that means they are minimally successful. There's no fatal flaw. A fatal flaw is like oh my God, the composition is bad. It's out of focus. The giant blob of orange in the middle of the frame destroys it. Whatever can be a fatal flaw. Then you do successive waves once you've established a baseline of elevating from that baseline. Once you've done that, then go back to the photographs that you did not choose and reconsider. Inevitably, there will be a handful that are worth bringing back into the mix. So that's the critical check yourself. But ideally, once you've done this, you don't go back. So many photographers work with, hey, do you remember like in frame 692 of 12,000? I thought that one kind of worked. And you're already down to a handful of 100 pictures or whatever.
Something that I had to learn, and it took me a while to get it, is that when putting together a portfolio or a group of pictures, it's important to separate a photograph that has a great story behind it, because you won't believe what I had to go through to get this picture. And it could be a great story with a lot of technical challenge. But at the end of the day, the picture is really kind of dull and boring and nothing much, but a great story. But we're stuck on the story.
Yeah.
And how often do you run into that where somebody would just, no, but listen to the story behind it. And again, you're looking at the photograph, the result.
It's funny. I think where that shows up most is in reviews with people. The New York Times reviews, a photographer gets 20 minutes. This one photographer spoke for 18 minutes, describing in infinite detail each photograph that she was showing and the experience of having made it. At the end, I said, "Thank you for showing me your work." And that was it.
Yeah. There's a similar thing that happens. I follow a lot of, on Instagram, and there's all these groups, and in Facebook, enthusiasts of particular camera brands. I won't mention them, and there's some people who have very expensive cameras, and they're posting pictures. I just took this with my brand new, which they paid $80,000 million for. And they're so thrilled. It's just, okay, it's sharp and the exposure's good, but it's not a good photograph. I think self-honesty also is part of the editing process, where you have to just be honest with yourself. And again, sometimes you need a picture editor to remind you about what counts. But I think ultimately, any good photographer, any good artist, visual artist, I don't care what your medium is, you should be able to look at your stuff after a while and be honest and say, okay, this one, it was good, but it ain't that good. And just leave it at that and just let it go and move on.
Absolutely. Pat yourself on the back for the experience and then move on. I mean, editing should be as much a learning process as any other part of it. Recognizing, okay, here's what I did to produce the stronger work, and here's what I did to produce the not so great work. And then saying, okay, I should do this to more frequently produce the stronger work.
Getting back to your book, which, again, I'm not going to stop praising, who would you say is the primary audience for your book? Is it students or those new to photography, photo enthusiasts seeking a better understanding of the pictures they make, established photographers who might be stuck in a rut? And that happens. We all get real comfortable or just bored to death with what we're doing, or all of the above again. Who is this book for? Honestly, I think it's for anybody. That's my take on it. But let's hear from you.
Well, that's good to hear, because those are the three primary groups. I mean, over the years in working with photographers at the highest caliber and just starting out, my goal has been to interact in a way that resulted in the photographer saying, "Thank you. I wouldn't have thought of doing it this way had we not had this engagement." So that's the real goal of the book, is just trying to open thoughts and ideas and ways of approaching image making, first at the individual level, and then expanding into narratives and larger things that you can express. And then the last chapter, one reviewer said was worth buying the book just for that, to rethink what it takes to creating an environment for yourself to make a living.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I mentioned at least once during the course of this podcast, I've been around the block a few times in the world of photography. I've been dancing with cameras my whole life. And I'm looking at this book and I'm reading this book and I'm reading a lot of things that I knew, but I hadn't thought about for a while. And I read a lot of little things that I knew, but never looked at it from that point of view or that perspective. So there's a lot of value here. So again, if you're a beginner, just pull up a comfortable chair and dig in, because there's a big meal being served to you. And if you've been around the block and you're pretty sure you know everything, you're going to learn more things too, and you're going to be reminded of a lot of things as well. And that's important, because just like we mentioned before, you get into a rut, you fall into a place and you got it all figured, you're on autopilot. Sometimes you need to be rattled a little bit, and it just makes you look things a little bit differently the next time you go out with a camera, either for yourself or on an assignment. So that makes the price of admission solid right there. So now that you've published this book, are you currently consulting on any book projects or have any new projects in the works?
Yeah, there's just an ongoing flow of those, which just seems to happen. A couple books in the works right now. I work with 3 different organizations right now too, which is in a part-time basis, just enough to have a voice without having to go through all the travails of a full-time job.
I hear you.
And then photographers reach out regularly, and we work together on individual projects and define a way to make them as successful as possible. I mean, I grew up in this little town in Nebraska, and I had no idea any of this existed. And I only got into this because I wanted to get out of that town, and the Air Force recruiter did the best job of convincing me that was the best way to get out of this town. And he plopped this book in front of me, and it was every job in the Air Force that an enlisted person could do, except for those that required math. And I flipped through the book and landed on this communications specialist, basically working on base newspapers. And I said, well, Jesus, that sounds so much better than actually working for a living. So that's what I've been doing ever since.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
I love it. That's great. As I said 50 times already, I really enjoyed going through your book, and I intend to go through it more because I have not hit the entire book yet. There was too much to hit in several sittings over the course of a few days, but I'm definitely going to be going back. It's been great speaking with you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people get this book, by the way?
Routledge is the publisher's website. Taylor and Francis /Routledge/Focal Press is the publisher. It's 20% off right now in that environment.
Well, we're going to have a link to that in our show notes. So any of our listeners who would like to join in on the party and find out what this is all about, just go to the show notes and follow the link. And we highly recommend it, really, really do. We've reviewed a lot of good books and discussed a lot of good books on this show, mostly with photography. This was about the nitty-gritty of photography, and it's the kind of stuff that makes the rest of your work successful. And again, if you want your work to get out there, and here's ways of making that possible. So again, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to speaking to you again sometime.
Well, thank you, Alan and Jill, for making this happen. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It was really great speaking with you.
All good stuff. Now, if you are a fan of the show, but you're not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests and show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast Group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. My name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of Jill Waterman and Mike Weinstein, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Ari for sponsoring this week's episode.